of the Union School, and this is In Touch. David Rodich is my guest today. With graduation fast approaching, he's going to be discussing some graduations of the past. Do you want to explain a little bit about Union School, David?
Well, the Union School, as we mentioned previously, was built in 1869, and the architect was Simeon Porter from Cleveland, who was one of the renowned architects of his age, and built many of the public buildings in Cleveland and the surrounding area, and also many of the fine mansions that once lined Euclid Avenue. In the beginning, the high school system was only a 3-year system, and consequently,
3 years?
It was only 3 years instead of 4. And after the school opened, the first class was graduated in 1877, consisting of 6 people. And the graduation exercises were held on the top floor of the school, which was unfinished. It was like a large attic where they would store extra chairs and things of that nature, and whenever they needed it for an assembly, they'd push things back. And it wasn't a very formal setting. And of course, in those early years, all of the students were required to present some type of an essay or a declamation in front of the city in order to earn their certificate.
Oh, good thing there were only 6.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that fell into disuse, because there were just too many for everyone to participate. There were no graduating classes in 1881 or 1883 because there weren't sufficient number of pupils. And the site of the ceremonies was changed to Pfeiffer's Hall, which we would now call the second floor of the Title Bureau on Main Street. And that was a large assembly hall. It was also known as Pfeiffer's Opera House. And they had stage shows there, and in fact even took horses up there on several occasions for different productions that were done. But the graduations were held there for a number of years, and also were held at the Methodist Church on Main Street, the original white frame building. And this continued until the Opera House was built in 1895. So beginning with the class of 1896, they were graduated from the Opera House.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to point something out in this picture, if I may. The Union School. In the background here are all farms. All the background of there's just nothing but farmland. This is North Lyman Street behind it.
Well, at that time, with Broad Street out in this direction and Main Street, of course, coming this way, most of the houses still had garden patches and outhouses and trash heaps, and the pioneers threw out next to nothing. So everything was saved for some eventual use. And as you point out in the background is South Lyman Street running that way, and the road actually didn't extend that far. In fact, it just went about to the back lot of the school, and it was all fenced in. You wouldn't be able to go down the hill behind the injector as we do now.
That's fascinating. Okay, and next we have...
Now, because of the dangerous conditions that existed with the Union School, Central School was built in 1907. We talked about that a couple of months ago. And after the 1922 addition, which added 22 classrooms in the auditorium, graduations were moved from the Opera House to the auditorium at Central School, what we would now call O.J. Work Auditorium.
Okay. And here we have...
This is the class of 1903, and at that time, classes were still small enough that you could get everyone in one small picture. You could get everyone to sit still long enough for that. As we mentioned, the 3-year system, in 1902, we changed in Wadsworth to a 4-year system, which was then becoming adopted statewide. Consequently, it eliminated the class of 1902, and the class of 1902 became the class of 1903.
Well, they were surprised.
They didn't get out as quickly as they might have thought. And among the familiar faces in that class are Nellie Harder, the editor of the Banner Press, who we've talked about before, and Don Young, who succeeded his father as president of the Ohio Match Company, Nellie's brother Nathan Harder, who became a professor of theology and was a dean at Thiel College in Pennsylvania. In fact, one of the buildings at Thiel is named in his honor. And also Carr Dibble, who was a longtime real estate and insurance man in Wadsworth with the firm of Allen Hartzell Dibble.
Okay, so this is the class of 1903. And next we have...
This is a close-up of 3 of the ladies that we saw in the previous picture. And one of the reasons I brought it was just to show how intricate their dresses were and the clothing at the time and the hairstyles. And on the left is Clara Engers Everhard, who was married to W.H. Everhard, who was president of the Ohio Salt Company. And in the center is Edith Kintz-Bixler, whose husband was in partnership with his brother-in-law in a pharmacy and notion store in Wadsworth. And then again, Nellie on the right-hand side.
Beautiful, beautiful women. Lovely clothes. Of course, women at that time were quite a bit smaller, too. I've gone to many museums and realized that I am larger than a man
Well,
from the 1900s.
That's true. Most of them were at that time. And but when you think of the convenience of permanent press and wash and wear and that type of thing, what they must have gone through with the primitive conditions, many people not even having electricity, having to heat the irons on the stove, and everything having to be sewn by hand. And I've never quite figured how they managed to walk through the streets. In the old movies that you watch, the women walk through the muddy streets and the dirty streets. Well, they can take their dress off and give it to the property mistress, and she can have it repaired for them. But you wonder how they did when they had to contend with it themselves.
And this is a picture here of...
again, of Nellie. Just a picture by herself.
Her senior picture, would you say, or the equivalent thereof?
That is her senior picture. And after she was graduated from Wadsworth School, she began to teach in the Stony Ridge District Schoolhouse, which is on what we would now call West Reimer Road.
Oh, okay.
And she taught for 1 year and decided that teaching was not for her and went back to her summer job of working at the newspaper, which of course became her lifelong career, luckily for us. Right.
How fortunate for us, you're right. Okay, and here we have another graduating class.
This is the class of 1899 with Superintendent F.M. Plank seated between the gentlemen in the front row. And he later became a probate judge in Medina County. He was superintendent of the schools for many years, and after that he moved to Medina where he became probate judge. Just as an aside, next to him is Dr. Paul Goss, who many people in Wadsworth will remember as a longtime dentist, and whose father was for over 40 years pastor of the Reformed Church in Wadsworth.
I'm pleased to see the number of women, too, that graduated. Oftentimes that it wasn't encouraged at that point.
It wasn't thought necessary, but luckily Wadsworth has always prized education. And consequently, there was usually the women outnumbered the men, because the men had to go back to work on the farms or go into the shops to support the family. So the women, they may not have gone on to college, but they were at least able to complete their high school education.
That's wonderful.
This is a picture of the class of 1922, which was taken in front of or actually behind the Central School.
Yeah, and it's gotten quite a bit. I'm going to move it a little bit here to see.
Now, we've come forward 23 years, but still they're able to get the entire class into a photo.
Yeah, he's standing back a little farther now.
This is a picture of the class of 1944. And they had to move clear to the back of the O.J. Work Auditorium to get everyone in. And shortly after this, a group picture of the graduating class ceased to be taken simply because you couldn't recognize anybody, you were so far away from them.
Exactly.
And that's where the individual pictures that we know now came into being. And you probably remember in the earlier days here in Wadsworth, in the 60s and 70s, when they would still publish pictures of all of the graduating class, individual photographs, in both the Wadsworth paper and the Medina County paper. But I think that's gone with the ages also.
Yes, I think
Now, we mentioned that the first commencement was held in 1877, and I don't have a program from that, but this is a program from the commencement of 1879, the third annual commencement.
Let's see if we can get this on.
And you see there was a total of 5 graduates that year. And this one was held in the school hall, which we talked about as being the attic of the school.
See, does this open?
It opens.
Oh, it opens this way.
And you'll notice that the different pupils all gave their essays or played some piece of music on the piano or flute or some other instrument, and they all had some part to play in the ceremony. It was taken very seriously, and surprisingly, these were very well attended.
By other than just the immediate family.
The public would show up. Of course, on the other hand, there wasn't a whole lot else to do in Wadsworth at the time, so this was a real occasion, and everyone was proud of the students for having made this attempt. Now, we've talked before about how I come about getting some of these items, And I had purchased a large box at an auction, which had Wadsworth items in it. And I got through the whole box, and I was down to the bottom, and I was looking through the different items once I got it home, very excitedly. And I noticed what I thought was an old matchbook cover stuck in the crease of the cardboard box in the bottom. And I started to pull it out, and I realized that it was that.
Yes, well, yeah, it's so small. I would not have thought this was a program.
It was something that might otherwise have been
Pitched out.
right or overlooked. Now, 100 years ago, last year, in 1889, those are the commencement programs in the invitation for the class of 1889. And the program came with more than one figure on it.
Oh, really?
There are figures of men and women in all different types of dress. So it was rather elaborate printing of the program for that time. And again, inside, they have the list of the different students who participated.
Okay, and this was the invitation?
Yes. Now, this one, this was the invitation for the 11th commencement, and it's made like an artist's palette.
Yes. How wonderful.
Now, at that time, the armory had been built in 1888 in Wadsworth, and some of the graduation exercises were held there also. I neglected to mention that. I think one of the most interesting graduation invitations or announcements that I've seen from Wadsworth is this one from the class of 1890. And it's what's called a cabinet photograph. Well, I think you're probably familiar with the smaller photographs called carte de visites, which were essentially visiting cards. You had your photograph taken on the little cards that were about 2 by 1.5 inches, and you would leave these at a house just as you leave a calling card. This size is called a cabinet photograph, and it's approximately 4 by 5, and it's hard-backed. It was taken at Captain Woolbaugh's studio. But you see in the center, it announces the commencement exercises of the class to be held at the armory, and then around the invitation are photographs of the superintendent, Mr. Plank, and of the school, and of the different members of the class, who in that year there were 7 graduates with their names underneath it. And that was the invitation that was given out to announce their commencement.
Wonderful. 1890.
Now, I neglected to bring it today, but one of the graduates in that year was, let's make sure she's on here, I'm sure she is, was Dora Gonzalez. And her daughter presented me a number of years ago with a swatch of cloth from her mother's graduation gown, which was kind of a bright pink color with little white dots and embroidery, and it was very attractive. And it's just another thing that helps you, it goes beyond just a regular paper commemorative and helps you feel a little bit more in touch with people of those years. We showed a picture earlier of the class of 1900, and this is their graduation invitation.
Wow, this is quite elaborate.
And you notice hanging down from it is a little scroll, and I'm not going to try and take it out now, but it says graduates on it, and if you take that out and roll it out, it has the names of all the graduates on it, just like a regular old-type diploma.
Oh, my. These are so elaborate. Let's see here, I can do this. I know I can. There we go. Okay, this has the motto, for life, not for school, we learn. The colors were pink and cream. These are class colors. I wonder how the men felt about that. Evidently, they were outvoted.
Either that or they were a little more liberal in those days. Of course, this is one of the announcements for this year's class of 1990.
Sure. Familiar to our cameraman here.
Using the class colors of red and white.
Yeah, no longer pink and cream, evidently they. And then usually the name would go right here.
Right, and often enclose the individual pictures that we made reference to before.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say another event that's always been an important part, not always, but has for the last 60 years perhaps it's been an important part of the senior year, is the prom. And the custom used to be that the junior class would give the prom as a party for the senior class. It would be their gift to the senior class.
Was it that way for you? Because it was that way for me.
No.
The difference in our age.
We had to do it on our own. And when I was graduated, they decided that they no longer wanted a formal prom. And so they followed the tradition of the junior class of having more of a party with skits and things like that. And I thought it was really awful. But, and some people embarrassed themselves that evening, doing things in front of the teachers and parents that I'm sure they
probably won't
forget about.
even do this weekend.
This is a picture of the prom from 1940. And their theme that year was a polar landscape. And we're assuming this had to do with Admiral Byrd's trip to the South Pole.
Exactly.
And the fact that the snow cruiser earlier that year had come through Wadsworth and it made an impression on so many of the people, so they perhaps picked up on that.
Yeah, it wasn't too romantic, it didn't seem.
And in the middle, we have the king and queen of the prom, Richard McGinnis and Laura Crossan, and their attendants, Edna Mae Overholt and Jeannie Rohr.
And these little girls would stand next to each couple for the picture taking?
They would help, and they would announce. They would also often get people from the junior high, boys and girls, who would dress. We saw a picture last month of the 1938 junior-senior prom, which had a nautical theme, where they had to cross a gangplank in order to get to the dance floor. And they had junior attendants from the junior high who were dressed in nautical clothes like sailor hats and that type of thing to carry it out. And behind them, of course, you see an igloo, and there's a doorway in the igloo, and you entered through that to get to the dance floor. And they had other decorations around, of course, that were in keeping with the festivities.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's at the prom that students receive keepsakes from their parents, or as we mentioned earlier, from the junior class. And some of the recent ones that we have,
Okay. I don't know if this...
it's perhaps too much glare to pick up,
we'll try.
but this is a candy dish or a little snifter from the prom from 1989, from the class of 1989.
Okay. I wonder where most of these are now. I think they're in someone's closet.
Well, that one was a gift. A lot of these things I pick up at yard sales. Apparently they either got
So much
away or
for
they
that.
attached too much sentimental value to it.
Okay.
This is one from the prom of 1987.
This looks like a little bit, be able to use this a little bit easier than like maybe a candy dish.
And when I was graduated,
Oh.
we got a keychain with a penny in it. I guess that must have been a hard economic year. And the penny bears the date of our graduation, and we'll go no further with that.
Yeah, we can't get a close-up of that.
Now, a gift that one of the classes left to the entire community, oftentimes, for instance, the bell from the old Mennonite College, which later became the Normal School on the site of the present Isham School, was mounted on a pedestal as a gift from one of the senior classes. And there are other evidences around the school of things that a particular class, they have additional money left in their treasury, and they'll donate something to the school or they'll participate in some type of project. But something that benefited the whole community was the class of 1938, which published a book, Wadsworth Center to City.
Oh, I didn't realize that was from their class.
Their English advisor was Eleanor Eiler Shapiro, which is a name familiar to us as a historian of Wadsworth. And she was the English advisor, the senior class advisor, and also the head of the English department. And one of the assignments for the English class that year was to go out with a questionnaire and interview people in Wadsworth about the history, their memories, and so forth. Well, when they came back to write their papers, it turned out that they had gathered so much information that it was decided to put it out in book form. And with Nellie Harder backing it financially, they published that book, Wadsworth Center to City, in both softbound and hardbound copies. The softbound was $1 and the hardbound was $1.50 delivered.
Oh my.
And in addition to the history of Wadsworth, which is covered topically in there, it has many fine drawings that were done by Betty Davis Spice and Warren Foley.
Okay. Oh my, architectural drawing. Yeah. We can
This
get
is a picture of the west side of Main Street at about 1874, showing the different store buildings and the businesses that existed at that time.
They copied these from photographs.
From photographs, and there were also drawings of churches and schools and other items of interest to the community. And it's really a wonderful effort on their part. And the only sad thing about it is that all their notes were put in storage. Of course, they gathered entirely too much information to use in one book, and their notes were stored away so they could be used for future research And during one of the remodeling projects at the central school, those were thrown out, along with a number of copies of the book. So unfortunately, those have been lost.
Now, I opened the book just to see if they listed the members of the class, and they did not mention them individually, did they?
I believe they did.
Okay, because it has it here, but maybe in the back.
I think in the beginning they listed, but they had a core group that actually did the writing and the typing, but the entire class participated in one way or another. Girls from the typing classes did the typing. Other people worked with the layout and things like this, and went through old newspapers to help reinforce the information they were given by the public. So there's the whole class participated in one way or another, and it's something of which they're very proud, and they're still a very active class, meeting together for reunions frequently.
I noticed at the back they have a list of the contributors of that historical information that compiled this book. I bet you would like to have been part of that.
Well, I probably would have confused them with my habit of being unclear about things. But one of the commemoratives that's given out by the class, or given to the class, that's kept, we talked about some of the other things that aren't always held on to, but one thing that's almost always kept is the yearbook, because people like to refer back to it and look at pictures of their classmates and different class activities. The first commencement annual was published in 1887, and it didn't take the form of a book as we think of a yearbook now, but was rather a newspaper. And I don't have it here today because it's so fragile.
I would imagine.
We decided to have it photographed so that there would be negatives of it available, so that nothing would happen to the original. But it gave an account of the different people in the class and gave their essays and other things, and it was quite an interesting thing. Then they didn't have another yearbook, as far as can be determined, until 1914. And again, as we talked about the prom being given by the junior class, the yearbooks were printed by the junior class for the seniors. Now, it's only been in recent years. Let's say you were graduated in 1960 and you bought your yearbook. It would have the prom and the graduation and all those things for the class of 1959 in it.
Right.
So you'd have to come back another year to get the one that had your activities in. And they changed that by delaying the publication of the yearbook so that they can try and get those things in, so it'll be more meaningful keepsake for those people. The first one that we have, this is The Whisperer, which, as I say, was issued in May of 1914.
Why did they call it The Whisperer?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. Boy, you can tell we haven't arranged this at all.
Hey,
Whisperer,
you just so happen to have a...
if you take the name Whisperer, it contains the letters WHS for Wadsworth High School. And that's why it was named The Whisperer. And this really, though it's much smaller, is not too much different than the yearbooks that are produced today. By that I mean they have pictures of the faculty, the Board of Education, individual pictures of the class members, and then also pictures of the different activities, the sporting events and so forth that they were involved in.
I'll get a picture here. It's not going to damage the book, is it, if I do?
Well, I don't know. We'll find out.
The book's ready.
We have the boys' basketball team at the top, and the girls' basketball team at the bottom. And you might notice they're posing out in front of the railing of what we would now call the office at the central school. When that school was built in 1907, there was no ceiling on the office level floor. That area in front of what we would call the offices of central school was the gymnasium. And the second, it was open to the roof, and they had a railing around the top floor. And that's where the students would stand, or the spectators, and watch games be played on the floor in the center. But eventually they became so cramped for space that they had to close that out, and that's what eventually, one of the things that occasioned the building of the 1922 edition. Now, even though we call our yearbook The Whisperer today, for some reason they decided to change it. Now, we've talked before about some of the different ways that I'm able to gather these different things. And someone who's a big help to me is the auctioneer Harold Farnsworth, who's a good friend of mine. And oftentimes, if I'm unable to attend an auction, if he sees something he thinks might be of interest, he'll buy it on my behalf. And one day, several years ago, I came home from work, and there was a message for me that Harold had bought me some papers and a Wadsworth anvil.
Where are you going to put an anvil in your house?
I thought I appreciated his thoughtfulness, but what am I going to do with this thing? And what exactly is a Wadsworth anvil? Was it made by the foundry, or? And I was trying to think about it. I just couldn't figure that out. And that evening I was at dinner with friends, and I related to them this story. They asked whether or not I'd come across anything lately, and I explained this. And as we were sitting there, the little light bulb went on above my head, and he meant the Wadsworth anvil, not the Wadsworth anvil, which was
the yearbook.
Now,
why did they name this the anvil?
well, I don't know.
Well, you had visual aids for the other one.
I guess because it was strong and useful.
I guess they didn't care for the tradition of the whisper.
Maybe they got the covers at a discount. I don't know. But the one bad thing that they do about it, they put the lower classes, the freshmen and sophomores, in a group picture, and they print the names on the next page, but they don't correspond.
Oh,
so unless you know, it's very difficult to find. But, of course, the Wadsworth anvil also contained the sports pictures and different things. That's the 1916-17 men's basketball team. But I was relieved that I didn't have to worry about where to store this other anvil. Now, it's interesting to me because there were only 23 members of the senior class that year. And I think there are more copies of this yearbook laying around. I've got about 7 myself, and the library has several, and I'm sure the school has a few. And
why?
I don't know
why in the world do they have some?
Others are very rare. So I don't know why there were so many for such a small class. Not happy with the name anvil. Perhaps they couldn't explain it either. They switched the next year to the shield.
Well, did each junior class then decide, maybe they voted on a specific name
I suppose,
to identify their class?
Now, in the anvil, it says that it's volume 3, but we've never been able to find a volume 2, so I think it's only volume 2, and that this would be volume 3, which was the shield, which was published in May of 1918 by the class of 1919. And because of it being during the war, a lot of it involved World War I.
I might get that picture. Don't want to break the book here, but really beautifully placed. And then it had their names and a little bit about each individual graduate.
A little bit about them, what type of activities they were involved in, and often they got into a habit a little later on where they'd give a little poem or a little quip about each person. And sometimes, for instance, if Mary was overweight, it would be something about, well, Mary's great even though she's overweight, or something that if you look back on, they're really pretty cruel, picking on people's shortcomings and people that weren't too bright and who couldn't get a date and other terrible things. And I suppose at the time maybe it was taken in jest, but I didn't think it was very nice. Now, yearbooks were only printed intermittently because of the cost involved in the effort, and like a lot of ideas, everyone's gung-ho in the beginning and then it falls off. Perhaps one of the most interesting yearbooks, which I do not have, is the class of 1934. And because it was during the Depression, they could not afford to have a professional yearbook. So they had to have individual pictures taken and then cut them out and glue them into the book. And there are some copies of that around, but they were just done sporadically. The next one of interest, I think, is the class of 1938. We talked about Wadsworth Center to City, and as I'm sure people will remember, 1938 was the 150th anniversary of the Northwest Ordinance.
I'll open this up. I'm sure I knew that.
Which, of course, led the way to Wadsworth and this area being settled. And so they used the Northwest Ordinance as the theme for their yearbook, and also published a lot of historic pictures of Wadsworth and people in there. So it's rather unusual from that aspect.
Nice volume to have.
And that was one of the things that prompted them, Mrs. Shapiro, to assign the task of writing the history of Wadsworth, occasion for that. Mrs. Shapiro later wrote Wadsworth Heritage in 1964 to coincide with the sesquicentennial of Wadsworth, and people assumed that Center to City was written to correspond with the 125th anniversary, but actually it was written the year before because of the Northwest Ordinance. I'm sure you know that. This one is interesting to me not only because it's colorful, but it was the last year that the high school was at Central School.
1960.
With the class of 1961, the 12th, 11th, and 10th grades moved to the senior high school.
I'm just going to kind of open this at random here. I don't feel so bad. This book is nice.
We have some of the track teams and the cheerleaders. And there was also, every year at that time, elected, in addition to the homecoming queen that we're familiar with, there was a Miss Whisperer, or a yearbook queen.
Oh, really?
And and they would put her measurements, her height and weight,
Wow.
and what her hobbies were, and who her favorite singer, if she liked Frank Sinatra or Bobby Darin, what her favorite colors were, and her favorite food, her favorite teacher, and do a little personnel profile on this woman. Now, the yearbooks have been rather standard until 1976, when Wadsworth, like the rest of the country, was celebrating our national bicentennial.
Okay.
And the class of 1976 published this rather striking yearbook with a blue cover and the bandstand on gold on the front.
It's beautiful. Then they made reference within the volume to the...
Yes, referring back to
this is in color too.
the bicentennial.
Nice. Okay.
And I think that's one of the first ones to start using color pictures in large number. And of course, this was last year's yearbook.
No, I saw this sitting here, and I didn't recognize it as a yearbook.
Which was loaned to me by Bob Durhammer, who's a member of our Board of Education.
Okay. Let's see. Now, it would look like they would have some color photographs in here. Maybe I've opened it to you. Interesting pictures.
It's hard to guess upside down exactly where to stop.
There's probably a lot of copies of this right now.
Something that we didn't mention, and I know you're probably wondering why I've left it there, and because I forgot about it, is the fact that the class always put on a senior play, and this was a very big activity, and it was very important that people be included in the... It was very worrisome for people to wonder whether or not they were going to get a select part in the class play. And this is just one of the early class plays.
It's a picture of...
which was taken at O.J. Work as they were rehearsing one of the plays. But this senior class play was always a very important event.
Okay. Well, do you have an idea what class or what play, perhaps?
No, I don't recall.
Yeah. I know you have a volume of collected graduation announcements.
Well, as I try to collect these, rather than just stuff them in a drawer somewhere, you want to preserve them in a way that would be appropriate. And unfortunately, doing this on my own, I'm unable to provide the proper archival quality materials to preserve these. But we try to keep them in good order so that they will be preserved and not damaged. And this is an example when we get these things, just what is done with them.
Oh, my heavens.
They're all cataloged. Now, some of these actually, this is just a volume of commencement announcements.
And you've collected these over the years.
These go back to the Wadsworth Normal School, which was the successor to the college.
This is 1894. I'm just kind of leafing through here randomly.
They're a little hard to see. The printing's rather small on some of them. But you have the class of 1919, the class of 1920, the baccalaureate addresses for 1915. And all of these little paper items that we get from Wadsworth are kept in albums. Now, this was getting into the 30s, and they got into heavier programs because they had more people. And some of the color printing. Most of those were printed right here at our high school print shop. But the things that we get are preserved, and we certainly appreciate any addition of yearbooks, or we still have a lot of gaps for yearbooks and announcements and programs or anything connected with the school, so that we can see that every class is represented because they all made their contributions.
If anyone should happen to find one of these, they could contact the school or you personally or the cable station?
They could contact me or the station. That would be fine. Because, like I said, the one that we found just in the bottom of a box, you don't know where they might turn up. And some that you might think would be very hard to find because of their age, like the old yearbook, there are many copies around. Now, the one with the bandstand on it is borrowed here from the school office because I don't have a copy of that myself, even though it's recent.
It's more valuable. Do you have any other goodies for us at this point?
I think we're done.
We're done. Okay.
We certainly wish the best wishes to all of the graduates of the class of 1990. Success for them in all future things.
Exactly.
maybe in the fall we can come back and prepare the incoming freshmen for what they have in store for them and some of the people who are going off to college.
Yeah. And thank you very much for watching In Touch. And thank you, David, for taking us back down memory lane.